Tony Bennett saved a young boy's Christmas. No one has forgotten what he did. Few voices in American music carried the weight of an entire era quite like Tony Bennett. Born to Italian immigrant parents in New York City, Bennett rose from poverty and wartime service to become one of the most respected singers in the history of popular music. While the world remembers him for timeless classics like I Left My Heart in San Francisco, few truly know the challenges, quiet battles, and defining moments that shaped his extraordinary career. From smoky jazz clubs to the world's greatest stages, Tony Bennett's story is not just about fame, it is about resilience, dignity, and a voice that refused to fade with time. This is the true story behind the legend, a journey of talent, struggle, and timeless grace. The cold December wind swept across Northern Boulevard in Astoria, Queens, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant sound of elevated trains rumbling overhead. In a cramped two-bedroom apartment above Benedetto's grocery store, 9-year-old Anthony Dominic Benedetto pressed his face against the frost-covered window, watching his breath fog the glass as he traced invisible melodies with his finger. "Tony, come away from there before you catch your death," his mother Anna called from the kitchen, where she was stretching a pot of vegetable soup with more water and whatever scraps she could find. The Great Depression had hit their neighborhood hard, and every meal was a careful calculation of pennies and prayers. Young Tony pulled back from the window, but his eyes lingered on the street below. Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs was sweeping snow from her stoop with quick, efficient strokes, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Mr. Torino from the barber shop was pulling down his metal grate earlier than usual. Business had been slow since the factory layoffs began. "Mama, why don't Papa come home for Christmas dinner anymore?" Tony asked, though he already knew the answer would bring that familiar shadow across his mother's face. Anna Benedetto paused in her stirring, her wooden spoon suspended over the thin broth. At 32, she looked older, the weight of raising 3 children alone, etching lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. "Your Papa, he's not coming home, Anthony. We talked about this." The boy nodded solemnly. His father Giovanni had died of heart failure when Tony was 7. Leaving behind debts, dreams, and a family struggling to stay afloat in a neighborhood where hope was becoming as scarce as steady work. But what Anna didn't know was that Tony had been visiting his father's grave in Calvary Cemetery, walking the 2 miles each way, talking to the weathered headstone about his dreams of becoming a singer. "Tony, help me set the table," his older sister Mary called from the living room, where she was transforming their small dining space for Christmas Eve dinner. At 14, Mary had assumed responsibilities far beyond her years, taking on seamstress work after school to help with expenses. Their youngest brother John, only 5, sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, carefully coloring a drawing of a Christmas tree with a stub of green crayon. As Tony arranged the mismatched plates and forks they'd borrowed from neighbors, he began humming softly, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. The melody was something he'd heard on the radio at Torino's barbershop, where he sometimes swept floors for nickels. Silent Night mixed with something entirely his own. "You and that singing," Mary said, with a mixture of affection and exasperation. "Mrs. Romano from 3B says you got a gift, but gifts don't put food on the table." Anna emerged from the kitchen carrying their modest Christmas Eve feast. The thin vegetable soup, a small loaf of bread she'd bartered for with Mrs. Goldstein at the bakery, and a precious orange, their only Christmas luxury, which she'd planned to divide among the 3 children. "Before we eat," Anna said, settling into her chair with the dignity she maintained despite their circumstances, "we say what we're grateful for." It was a tradition she'd maintained even through the hardest months, believing that gratitude was free and therefore something they could always afford. John spoke first, his 5-year-old voice bright with innocence. "I'm grateful for Mama's soup, and for Tony's singing, and for not being cold tonight." Mary cleared her throat, her teenage seriousness evident. "I'm grateful for Mrs. Peterson giving me extra sewing work, And for our neighbors who share what they have, and she glanced at her younger brother, for Tony making us laugh even when things are hard. All eyes turned to Tony. At 9, he possessed an unusual gravity for his age, a byproduct of loss and responsibility that had aged him beyond his years. But when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that seemed to fill their small apartment. "I'm grateful for Mama keeping us together," he said, reaching across to touch Anna's work-worn hand. "And for Mary being so smart and strong. And for Johnny's drawings that make our walls look happy. And—" he paused, looking around their modest home as if seeing something others might miss. "For music being free. Nobody can take that away. Right, Mama?" Anna's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "That's right, baby. Music belongs to whoever needs it most." After dinner, as they sat around their tiny Christmas tree, really just a branch Mary had decorated with paper angels and strips of colored fabric, Tony began to sing. His young voice, still unchanged but already carrying hints of the texture that would later make him famous, filled their apartment with "O Holy Night." The neighbors in their tenement building gradually grew quiet. Mrs. Kowalski stopped moving around upstairs. The Goldstein family's radio went silent. Even the elevated train seemed to pause between stations. Tony's voice carried through thin walls and into hearts that had almost forgotten what hope sounded like. When he finished, the silence was complete, not empty, but full of something indefinable. Anna pulled her youngest son close, and for a moment their cramped apartment felt as spacious as Carnegie Hall. "You're going to sing for the whole world someday," she whispered into his hair. "But promise me something, Anthony. Promise me you'll never forget where music comes from. It comes from here." She placed her hand over his heart. "From the part of us that needs to give something beautiful to others." Tony nodded against his mother's shoulder, not fully understanding the weight of her words, but sensing their importance. Outside, snow began falling again, dusting Northern Boulevard with a clean whiteness that made even their struggling neighborhood look magical under the streetlights. Later that night, as his siblings slept, Tony lay awake listening to the sounds of Astoria, distant train whistles, the occasional car rumbling over frozen streets, and the muffled conversations of neighbors whose Christmas Eve celebrations were as modest as their own. But he also heard something else, melodies that seemed to emerge from the very walls of their building, from the dreams and struggles of everyone around him. He began to understand, even at 9 years old, that music wasn't just about beautiful sounds. It was about connection, about reaching across the spaces between people and touching something they didn't even know they needed touched. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Music comes from the part of us that needs to give something beautiful to others. As sleep finally took him, Tony Benedetto, who would one day become Tony Bennett, was already beginning to learn the lesson that would define his entire life. That true artistry wasn't about taking from the world, but about giving to it, especially when you had very little to give. The snow continued falling outside, covering Astoria in quiet beauty, while inside a small apartment, a future legend dreamed of stages and audiences, and the moment when his voice would become a bridge between hearts that needed to remember they weren't alone. By the time Tony turned 15, Astoria had become a different place. The Depression had deepened its grip on their neighborhood, and the Benedetto family had moved twice, each time to smaller quarters, as Anna struggled to keep them together on her meager earnings from cleaning offices in Manhattan. Their current apartment was a single room with a kitchenette in a building that housed 12 families, most of them Italian immigrants like themselves. The walls were thin enough that Tony knew the Romano family's arguments by heart, could predict when little Giuseppe Caruso would start crying for his bottle, and had memorized the way old Mr. Petrucci coughed each morning at exactly 6:15. "Anthony, you're going to be late for school again," Mary called from their shared corner, where she was getting dressed behind a makeshift curtain Anna had sewn from old bedsheets. At 19, Mary had become the family's primary breadwinner, working double shifts at a garment factory in Long Island City. Tony was sitting on the floor, carefully shining his only pair of shoes with a rag and some cooking oil, a trick he'd learned from watching his classmates whose families could afford actual shoe polish. His reflection in the scuffed leather showed a tall, lanky teenager with dark eyes that had seen too much for his age, but still held an unmistakable spark of determination. "I ain't going to school today," he announced quietly, not looking up from his shoes. Anna, who had been preparing for her morning cleaning shift, stopped mid-motion. "What did you say?" "I got a job, Mama. Real work. Mr. Torino says I can sweep his barbershop full-time, and Mrs. Goldstein needs someone to deliver bread in the mornings before school. Between both jobs, I can make almost $2 a week." The silence in their cramped room was deafening. Mary peeked around the curtain, her face a mixture of pride and concern. Anna sat down heavily on the edge of their shared bed, suddenly looking every one of her 40 years. "Anthony, you need your education. Without school, you'll end up—" She gestured around their meager surroundings, unable to finish the sentence. "I'll end up helping my family," Tony said, finally meeting her eyes. "Mama, I see how tired you are. I see Mary working her fingers raw. And for what? So I can sit in a classroom learning about George Washington when we don't have enough coal to heat this place." Anna's hand went to her throat, where she unconsciously touched the small gold cross Giovanni had given her on their wedding day, the only valuable thing she hadn't yet sold. "But you're singing, baby. You got such a gift. Mr. Santangelo says you could maybe get into that music school in Manhattan, the one where rich kids study. Music don't pay bills, Mama." "You said so yourself." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Tony had heard variations of this conversation in apartments throughout their building, dreams deferred, talents buried under the weight of simple survival. Mary emerged from behind the curtain, fully dressed for her factory shift. "Maybe," she said carefully, "maybe Tony could do both, work in the mornings, go to school in the afternoons." But Tony was already shaking his head. "The Torino job is full-time or nothing. He's got 3 other guys who want it." What Tony didn't tell them was that he'd been awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of their building, his mother's quiet crying, Mary's exhausted sighs, the general weight of desperation that seemed to press down on everyone they knew. He'd made his decision not from a lack of dreams, but from a clear-eyed understanding of their reality. At Torino's barbershop that morning, Tony swept floors and organized bottles with an efficiency that impressed the older Italian men who gathered there to read newspapers and argue about politics. The shop smelled of bay rum and cigarette smoke, and the radio in the corner played everything from Italian folk songs to the latest swing numbers from the city. "Hey, Benedetto!" called out Sal Torino from behind his barber chair, where he was giving Mr. DeLuca his weekly shave. "You know any of these songs they're playing?" Tony paused in his sweeping. On the radio, Bing Crosby was crooning "Pennies from Heaven," his smooth voice seeming to float above the static and the street noise filtering in from Northern Boulevard. "I know some of them," Tony said modestly. "Some of them?" laughed Frank Rossini, a regular customer who worked nights at the Steinway Piano Factory. "Kid's been humming along to every song for the past hour. Got a voice like an angel, this one." "Let's hear it then," Sal said, pausing in his work. "Give us a song, Anthony." Tony felt every eye in the barbershop turn toward him. These were men who had worked hard all their lives, men who understood both dreams and disappointments. They weren't asking him to perform. They were asking him to share something that might make their day a little brighter. He began with "Pennies from Heaven," but his version was different from Crosby's. Where Crosby was smooth and polished, Tony's voice carried the rougher edges of their neighborhood, the weight of real struggle, the kind of hope that had been tested by actual hardship. Every conversation in the barbershop stopped. Sal Torino's razor hung suspended in the air. Frank Rossini's newspaper dropped to his lap. Even the radio seemed to fade into the background. When Tony finished, the silence stretched for several seconds before erupting into genuine applause. "Madonna mia," whispered Sal. "Where'd you learn to sing like that?" "Just picked it up, I guess. From the radio, from church, from—" Tony shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. From living, finished Frank Rossini quietly. That's what I hear in your voice, kid. Life, real life. Over the following weeks, Tony's morning performances at the barbershop became a neighborhood institution. Word spread through the Italian community, and people began timing their visits to hear little Benedetto sing. Construction workers would stop by before their shifts. Housewives would delay their shopping to listen from the sidewalk outside. But it was Mrs. Goldstein, the elderly Jewish baker who employed Tony for afternoon deliveries, who changed everything. You know, she said one December afternoon, as Tony loaded warm loaves into his delivery bag, my nephew Irving, he works for a music publisher in Manhattan. Real music, not just the neighborhood stuff. He comes to visit Sunday dinners. Tony looked up from his work. Mrs. Goldstein was a practical woman who rarely spoke about anything beyond bread and business. He hears you sing sometimes when he picks up his weekly challah, she continued. Says you got something special, something that reminds him of the singers who make records. Records, Tony's voice cracked slightly on the word. Professional singers, Anthony, the ones on the radio. Irving says if you ever want to try singing for real people, people in the music business, he could maybe introduce you to someone. That night, Tony walked home through the December cold with Mrs. Goldstein's words echoing in his mind. The streets of Astoria looked the same. Tired buildings, tired people, the eternal struggle visible in every storefront and every face. But something had shifted in his understanding of possibility. At home, he found Anna mending socks by the light of their single lamp, her eyes straining over the tiny stitches that would make their worn clothing last another month. Mama, he said, settling beside her on their small couch, what if music could pay bills? Anna looked up from her mending, studying her son's face in the lamplight. She saw Giovanni's determination there, but also something else. A quiet confidence that hadn't been there a few months ago. What do you mean, baby? Tony told her about Mrs. Goldstein's nephew, about the possibility of meeting real music people, about the chance that his voice might be something more than just neighborhood entertainment. Anna set down the neon lights of the Copa reflected off the wet Manhattan streets as Tony Bennett stepped out of the black Lincoln Continental, his breath visible in the December air of 1962. The doorman, a grizzled Irish immigrant named Murphy who'd worked the club for 20 years, tipped his hat with the kind of respect reserved for the genuine article. Evening, Mr. Bennett. Cold one tonight. Evening, Murphy. How's that grandson of yours? The one who wants to be a musician? Murphy's weathered face lit up. Still practicing that trumpet every day, thanks to you asking. Means the world to him that Tony Bennett knows his name. But as Tony walked through the club's entrance, past the red velvet ropes and gold-framed photographs of legends who'd graced this stage, he carried with him the weight of newfound fame that still felt surreal. I Left My Heart in San Francisco had catapulted him from respected crooner to household name, but with that recognition came expectations that sometimes felt heavier than the poverty of his childhood. The Copa's interior buzzed with the energy of New York's elite. Cigarette smoke created a hazy atmosphere that softened the harsh edges of ambition and money. At corner tables, record executives leaned close to discuss deals worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. Near the stage, socialites draped in pearls and mink stoles laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny, their laughter a currency in itself. Tony? The voice belonged to Jack Entratter, the Copa's legendary owner, a man who could make or break careers with a phone call. His massive frame cut through the crowd like a ship through calm water. You were magnificent last night. The phones haven't stopped ringing. Tony shook hands with genuine warmth, but something in his expression suggested he was still processing the rapid changes in his life. Thank you, Jack. Though I have to admit, sometimes I wonder if the guy singing up there is really me. Entratter's laugh was hearty, but understanding. That's the mark of a true artist, questioning himself even at the top. But let me tell you something, what you did with that Sinatra song last week, making it completely your own without losing respect for the original, that's genius. As they talked, Tony's eyes wandered to a young couple at a nearby table. The woman, probably in her early 20s, wore a simple dress that suggested modest means, while her companion, a soldier on leave judging by his military haircut, held her hand with the tenderness of someone who knew time was precious. They were sharing a single dessert, making it last, their eyes bright with the kind of love that doesn't need expensive surroundings to flourish. "Excuse me for a moment, Jack," Tony said, and walked over to their table. The couple looked up, startled. The young woman's hand went to her throat in surprise. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Tony said, his voice gentle. "I'm Tony Bennett, and I just wanted to say thank you for coming tonight. Would you mind if I sang something for you?" The soldier stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Mr. Bennett, sir, we saved up for weeks to be here. This is our last night before I ship out to Germany." Tony felt that familiar tug in his chest, the one that connected him to every story of struggle and hope he encountered. "What's her name?" "Sarah," the soldier said, his voice thick with emotion. Tony walked to the small piano near their table, where the house pianist was taking a break. He sat down, his fingers finding the familiar keys, and began to play a soft, improvised melody. "This is for Sarah and her soldier," he announced to the room, "and for everyone who knows that love is the most valuable thing we have." His voice filled the intimate space with "The Way You Look Tonight," but he sang it as if he'd written it specifically for this couple, his eyes moving between them and the keys, creating a moment that transcended performance and became something sacred. When he finished, the entire room was silent, except for Sarah's quiet crying. Tony returned to their table and placed a signed napkin before them. "Keep loving each other," he said simply. "That's what gets us through everything else." Back at the bar, Jack Entratter shook his head in amazement. "Tony, you just turned your performance into their memory. That's not something they teach in music school." But Tony was already thinking about something else. "Jack, you know about those hospital visits the record company wants me to do? The Christmas charity thing?" "Yeah, standard publicity stuff. Good for the image, helps with the press." "Why?" Tony's expression grew thoughtful. "I want to do them, but not the way they're suggesting. No cameras, no reporters, just me and whoever needs to hear some music." Entratter raised an eyebrow. "That's not very smart business-wise. You won't get any press coverage out of it." "Maybe that's the point," Tony said. "Maybe the best things we do are the ones nobody writes about." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tony's manager, Derek Holbrook, a sharp-dressed man whose every gesture suggested calculated ambition. He moved through the club like he owned it, his eyes constantly scanning for opportunities and threats. "Tony, there you are. We need to talk about the West Coast tour. The promoters are offering double your usual fee, but they want you to add some rock and roll numbers to the set list. You know, appeal to the younger crowd." Tony's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Derek, we've discussed this. I'm not changing my music to chase trends. But the money doesn't matter if I lose who I am getting it." Derek's expression shifted to the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Tony, this business changes fast. Today you're hot, tomorrow you're yesterday's news. You have to evolve. Evolution and abandoning your principles are different things," Tony replied, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't get here by copying what everyone else was doing." The tension between them was palpable, representing a fundamental divide that would only grow deeper in the coming years. Derek saw an entertainer who needed to adapt to market demands. Tony saw an artist who had a responsibility to honor the traditions that had given his life meaning. "Think about it," Derek said finally, then moved away to schmooze with potential contacts. Jack Entratter had been listening to the exchange with interest. "He's not wrong about the business changing, Tony. Rock and roll isn't going away." "Neither is good music," Tony replied. "My father died when I was 10, Jack. My mother cleaned houses to keep us fed. Music saved my life, not because it made me rich, but because it gave me something to believe in. I'm not going to dishonor that for any amount of money." As the evening wound down, Tony found himself at the piano again, this time alone. The club had mostly emptied, leaving behind the debris of another night's entertainment. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with cigarette smoke. His fingers moved across the keys, finding a melody that had been haunting him for days. It wasn't a song he'd learned, or one that was popular on the radio. It was something emerging from the collision between his past and present, between the boy who'd sung on street corners and the man who now commanded stages across the country. Murphy, the doorman, appeared at his shoulder. "That's beautiful, Mr. Bennett. What's it called?" Tony paused, his hands still on the keys. "I don't know yet. Maybe it doesn't need a name." "The best things usually don't," Murphy said, with the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize truth when he heard it. As Tony finally left the Copa that night, walking out into the December cold that bit through his expensive overcoat, he carried with him the weight of choices yet to be made. Success had brought him opportunities his younger self could never have imagined, but it had also brought pressures that tested everything he believed about art, integrity, and what it meant to use whatever gifts you'd been given. The city around him hummed with the energy of people chasing dreams, making compromises, deciding who they wanted to become. Tony Bennett, born Anthony Dominic Benedetto in Queens, raised by a widowed mother who believed in the power of beauty to transcend hardship, was about to discover that the most important stages weren't always the ones with spotlights. Chapter 7. Crossing Paths. The pediatric ward at Mount Sinai Hospital possessed that particular quality of institutional kindness. Floors polished to a sterile shine, walls painted in colors meant to be cheerful, but somehow achieving only a determined optimism. It was 3 days before Christmas 1962, and the hospital staff moved with the efficient compassion of people who'd learned to balance professional necessity with human warmth. Dr. Margaret Chen had been working the children's wing for 7 years, long enough to recognize that healing required more than medical expertise. She stood at the nurses' station, reviewing charts with the kind of focused attention that had made her one of the hospital's most respected pediatricians. "Dr. Chen." The voice belonged to Patricia Williams, the ward's head nurse, a woman whose maternal instincts had found their perfect expression in caring for sick children. "The Bennett people called again about the visit this afternoon. They want to confirm the photographers will have good access." Dr. Chen looked up from her charts, her expression showing a flicker of annoyance. "Photographers? I thought this was supposed to be about the children, not publicity." "Apparently Mr. Bennett's management sees it differently. They want shots for the newspapers, something about his charitable work during the holidays." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tony Bennett himself, 2 hours early and notably alone. He wore a simple grey coat and carried what appeared to be a small guitar case, his manner suggesting someone who preferred arriving quietly rather than making grand entrances. "Excuse me," he said to Patricia. "I'm Tony Bennett. I believe I'm scheduled to visit with some of the children this afternoon, but I was wondering if I could come up early. Maybe spend a little more time." Patricia exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. They'd expected an entourage, photographers, the whole machinery of celebrity charity work. Instead, here was a man who seemed genuinely interested in being where he was. "Of course, Mr. Bennett," Dr. Chen said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Chen. We appreciate you taking time during the holidays. Please, call me Tony, and thank you for letting me come. I know how busy hospitals get, especially around Christmas." As they walked down the corridor, past rooms where children in various stages of recovery watched television or played quietly with visiting family members, Tony's attention seemed completely focused on his surroundings. He noticed the hand-drawn Christmas decorations taped to walls, the way afternoon sunlight slanted through windows, the careful balance between medical efficiency and human comfort. "How many children are in the ward right now?" he asked. 32, Dr. Chen replied. "Ages range from infants to 17, various conditions. Some are here for surgery, others for longer-term treatment." They paused outside a room where a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sat alone by the window. His thin frame was emphasized by hospital pajamas that seemed too large, and his dark hair had been recently cut, probably by his mother, in the awkward, loving way of parents doing their best with unfamiliar tasks. "That's Tommy Russo," Patricia said quietly. "He's been here for 6 weeks. Leukemia. His family as well, they visit when they can, but his father works 2 jobs, and his mother has 3 other children at home." Tony stopped walking. Something in the boy's posture, the way he sat perfectly still, watching the world outside as if memorizing it, reminded him of himself at that age, after his father died, when he'd learned that sometimes being alone was safer than hoping for company that might not come. "Can I meet him?" Dr. Chen nodded, and they entered the room quietly. Tommy looked up, his dark eyes curious but cautious. "Hello," Tony said, sitting in the chair beside the bed without being invited, making himself physically smaller and less threatening. "I'm Tony. I heard you might like some company." Tommy studied him with the seriousness of a child who'd learned to read adults quickly. "Are you a doctor?" "No, I'm a singer. Not as important as doctors, but I know some songs." "My mom sings," Tommy said, his voice carrying the unconscious pride children have for their parents' abilities. "She sings while she makes dinner. Italian songs mostly." Tony's face lit up with genuine interest. "Italian songs. My mother used to sing those too. What's your favorite?" "O Sol Mio," Tommy replied, then added shyly, "but I don't know all the words." Tony reached for his guitar case and removed a classical guitar that had seen years of use but was maintained with obvious care. "Would you like to learn them? The words, I mean." For the next half hour, Tony taught Tommy the verses to O Sole Mio, singing softly in both Italian and English, explaining what the words meant, sharing stories about his own childhood in Queens, and his mother's voice filling their small apartment with the songs of her homeland. Tommy's initial reserve gradually melted away as he discovered that this stranger genuinely listened to his questions and answered them without the careful cheerfulness adults usually employed around sick children. When Tommy mentioned that he'd been learning to draw before coming to the hospital, Tony asked to see his sketches, praising the boy's natural sense of composition and attention to detail. "You see things the way artists do," Tony told him. "The way you drew that tree, you noticed how the branches don't all grow the same direction. Most people miss that." Dr. Chen, watching from the doorway, realized she was witnessing something unusual. Tony wasn't performing for Tommy. He was connecting with him, treating him as a complete person rather than a patient to be cheered up. The spell was broken by the arrival of Derek Holbrook and a photographer, their entrance accompanied by the bustle of people accustomed to controlling situations. "Tony, there you are," Derek said, his voice carrying the jovial authority of someone managing a successful operation. "We need to get some shots with you and the kids. The hospital administrator is here, and we want to make sure we capture this for the Christmas press release." Tony's expression shifted, a subtle closing that Tommy noticed immediately. The boy's eyes moved between Tony and the newcomers, sensing the change in atmosphere without understanding its cause. "Actually," Tony said, standing slowly, "I'd like to spend more time just visiting. Maybe we could skip the photographs today." Derek's smile maintained its professional warmth while his eyes expressed pointed disagreement. "Tony, we discussed this. The label is spending money on this promotion, and we need to show results." The conversation continued in low voices, but Tommy heard enough to understand that Tony's presence had been arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The realization struck him with the particular hurt children feel when they discover that adult kindness sometimes comes with ulterior motives. Tony must have sensed the boy's withdrawal, because he turned back to the fluorescent lights of Columbia Records' executive conference room, cast a harsh glow across the polished mahogany table, illuminating the tension that had settled over the meeting like morning fog over the Hudson River. Tony Bennett sat at the far end, his hands folded carefully in his lap, watching as men in grey suits shuffled through charts and graphs that reduced his life's work to coloured lines trending downward. "The numbers don't lie, Tony," said Clive Davis, the label's new president, his voice carrying the weight of corporate authority. At 36, Davis was younger than Bennett by a decade, but his reputation for transforming careers preceded him. Rock is the future. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, they're moving units. Your last album barely broke even. The room felt smaller than it was, filled with the accumulated smoke of countless cigarettes and the faint hum of the building's heating system. Through the window, Tony could see the bustling streets of Manhattan, where people hurried past in their winter coats, each absorbed in their own struggles and dreams. It was December 1968, and America itself seemed to be at a crossroads. Vietnam raged on, cities had burned with protest and pain, and the music that had once united generations now seemed to divide them. "I understand the business has changed," Tony replied, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "But there's still an audience for quality music, for songs that mean something." A younger executive leaned forward, his enthusiasm barely contained. "What we're proposing is revolutionary, Mr. Bennett. We want you to record with contemporary musicians, maybe cover some Beatles songs, work with a rock producer. Laura Nyro is writing incredible material. We could get you in the studio with her." The suggestion hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Tony had heard whispers of this meeting for weeks, had seen other artists his age being pushed toward sounds that felt foreign on their tongues. Perry Como had tried it. Dean Martin was considering it. The industry was changing, and those who couldn't adapt would be left behind. But as Tony sat there, listening to talk of synthesizers and electric guitars, his mind drifted to a different kind of music. The sound of his father's voice humming Italian folk songs while shaving in their cramped Astoria bathroom. The way his mother's laughter had harmonized with the radio during those rare moments of joy in their Depression-era apartment. Music, real music, wasn't about following trends. It was about truth. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," Tony said finally, standing up from his chair. "But I won't compromise the music that made me who I am. There's nothing wrong with rock and roll. It has its place. But so do the standards. So does real singing." Davis's expression tightened. "Tony, be realistic. Your fan base is aging. Young people aren't buying your records. We're trying to help you stay relevant." "Relevant to who?" The question came out sharper than Tony intended. He softened his tone, drawing on the diplomatic skills he'd learned from years in the business. "Look, I've been singing these songs for 20 years because they speak to something eternal in people. Love, loss, hope, dreams, these things don't go out of style." The meeting ended without resolution, but Tony knew he had drawn a line in the sand. Walking out onto 6th Avenue, he felt the December cold bite at his face and found it oddly refreshing. The city moved around him in its relentless rhythm. Taxi horns honking, pedestrians rushing toward their destinations, the distant sound of construction mixing with the urban symphony he had grown up loving. That evening, Tony found himself at the Algonquin Hotel's Oak Room, nursing a scotch and watching the late crowd filter in. The venue was smaller than the Copa or the Rainbow Room, more intimate, filled with the kind of conversation and laughter that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with performing in the first place. Jazz pianist Bill Evans was at the piano, his delicate touch turning familiar standards into something both nostalgic and freshly discovered. "Tony Bennett?" a voice called from across the room. He turned to see Frank Sinatra approaching, his characteristic swagger unchanged despite the pressures they all faced. Frank slid into the opposite booth, his eyes carrying the weight of similar battles with record executives. "I heard about your meeting today," Frank said, signaling the waitress for his usual Jack Daniels. "Word travels fast in this business." Tony nodded, watching the amber liquid swirl in his glass. "They want me to go electric, Frank. Cover rock songs. Become someone I'm not." Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They told me the same thing 6 months ago. You know what I said? I said, I am what I am, and I sing what I sing. If that's not enough, then find somebody else. And how's that working out? Some days better than others. Frank's honesty was refreshing. But I sleep well at night, knowing I didn't sell my soul for a few chart positions. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two veterans of the music wars, watching Evans work his magic at the piano. The room was filled with people who understood the value of craftsmanship, who appreciated the subtle art of interpretation that separated mere singing from true artistry. You know what the real problem is, Frank continued, his voice lower now, more thoughtful. They think music is just a product, something you manufacture to fit the market. They don't understand that the best songs, the ones that last, come from someplace deeper. Tony thought about his early days, singing in army camps during the war, watching hardened soldiers tear up when he performed "I'll Be Seeing You." He remembered the woman in Detroit who had thanked him after a show, telling him his version of "The Way You Look Tonight" had been played at her wedding 20 years earlier. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was the soundtrack to people's lives. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young couple, clearly tourists from their wide-eyed expressions and camera around the man's neck. They hesitated at the edge of the table, the woman gently nudging her husband forward. "Excuse me," the man said nervously. "Are you Tony Bennett?" Tony smiled and nodded. "I am. How can I help you folks?" "My wife and we saw you at the Copa 2 years ago for our anniversary. It was magical. We just wanted to thank you." The woman stepped closer, her voice soft but earnest. "Your music means so much to us. When our son was in Vietnam, he came back safe, thank God. But when he was over there, we would play your records and somehow feel closer to him, like the songs were bringing him home." As the couple walked away, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a perfect New York moment, Tony felt something shift inside him. This was what mattered, not chart positions or demographic studies, but the way music could bridge distances, heal wounds, provide comfort in dark times. "See what I mean?" Frank said quietly. "That's why we can't give in to the suits. Someone has to keep the flame burning." The evening wound down with Evans playing a haunting version of "Autumn Leaves," the notes floating through the smoke-filled room like memories made tangible. Tony found himself thinking about legacy, about what it meant to be an artist in a world that seemed increasingly focused on disposable entertainment. As he walked back to his apartment through the December night, the city's lights reflecting off the wet pavement, Tony made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He wouldn't chase trends or try to become someone he wasn't. Instead, he would double down on what made him unique, trusting that authenticity would find its audience, even if it took time. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying. In a business built on compromise, choosing artistic integrity was a gamble that could end his career. But as he thought about that couple in the Oak Room, about all the lives his music had touched over the years, he knew it was the only choice he could live with. Tomorrow, he would call his manager and start planning his next move, independent of Columbia's wishes, guided only by his artistic compass and the belief that great music, like great art, transcends the moment of its creation to speak to something eternal in the human experience. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Tony's Upper West Side apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors where sheet music lay scattered like autumn leaves. It was January 1969. And the city was slowly shaking off the previous year's trauma, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the riots at the Democratic Convention, the endless war that seemed to consume young lives without purpose. Tony sat at his piano, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as his fingers moved across the keys, searching for something he couldn't quite name. The melody that emerged was melancholy yet hopeful, reflecting the complex emotions he'd been carrying since his standoff with Columbia Records. His decision to resist their pressure to go contemporary had cost him. Radio play was becoming scarce, and booking agents were suggesting he consider smaller venues. The phone rang, interrupting his musical meditation. His manager's voice carried the weight of difficult news. "Tony, we need to talk. The Flamingo in Vegas had to cancel your March dates. They're going with a younger act, something about changing demographics." The words stung, but Tony had been expecting them. "What about the summer tour?" "Still working on it, but it's going to be different. Smaller markets, maybe some casino lounges. The big concert halls are booking rock acts almost exclusively now." After hanging up, Tony walked to his window and looked out at Central Park, where early morning joggers traced paths through the snow-dusted landscape. The city was waking up to a new decade, and he was being left behind by an industry that had once celebrated him as its golden boy. But rather than despair, Tony felt a strange sense of liberation. If the mainstream music business no longer wanted him, perhaps it was time to rediscover why he had started singing in the first place. He thought about the small clubs in Greenwich Village, where young folk singers were creating something real and meaningful, about the jazz venues in Harlem, where artistry still mattered more than demographics. That afternoon, Tony made an unexpected visit to the Village Vanguard, the legendary jazz club where so many careers had been born and legends had been made. The venue was nearly empty in the daylight hours, but owner Max Gordon was there, sorting through booking sheets and nursing his own cup of coffee. "Tony Bennett," Max said with genuine surprise. "What brings you to my humble establishment?" "I wanted to talk to you about performing here," Tony replied, settling into one of the club's small chairs. "I know it's not my usual venue, but I think it might be exactly what I need." Max raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? This place holds maybe 178 people on a good night. You're used to theaters and concert halls." "That's exactly why I want to do it. I want to get back to the music, to really connect with the audience. No elaborate production, no backup singers, just me, the piano, and the songs." Over the next hour, they worked out the details for a week-long engagement in February. Word spread quickly through the jazz community, creating a buzz that the mainstream media had largely ignored. Musicians who had grown up listening to Tony's records began talking about the intimate shows, about the chance to see a master craftsman in a setting where every note mattered. The first night of the Village Vanguard run, Tony arrived to find a line stretching around the block despite the bitter February cold. The audience was different from his usual crowd. Younger jazz enthusiasts, fellow musicians, music critics who had written him off but were curious about this unexpected career move. Standing in the small backstage area, Tony felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since his earliest performances. There would be no hiding behind elaborate arrangements or stage effects. This was pure performance, the kind of vulnerability that separated true artists from mere entertainers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Max's voice carried across the packed room, "please welcome Tony Bennett." The applause was warm but uncertain, as if the audience wasn't sure what to expect. Tony walked to the piano where his longtime collaborator Ralph Sharon waited, their eyes meeting in understanding. This wasn't about proving anything to record executives or reclaiming lost commercial success. This was about remembering why music mattered. "Good evening," Tony said simply, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space. "I want to thank you for being here tonight. This is the kind of room where music was meant to be heard, close enough that we can look each other in the eye and share something real." He opened with "Fly Me to the Moon," but the arrangement was stripped down, conversational, as if he were singing to friends in his living room. By the second verse, the tension in the room had dissolved, replaced by the kind of musical intimacy that made the Village Vanguard legendary. Between songs, Tony talked about the music itself, the stories behind the lyrics, the composers who had crafted these timeless melodies, the way certain songs had evolved in his understanding over the years. The audience leaned in, drawn into his world by the combination of technical mastery and emotional honesty. "This next song," Tony said, adjusting his position at the microphone, "was written by Johnny Mercer and Harold Arlen in 1944. Most people know it from Judy Garland, but I've always heard something different in it, a kind of quiet hope that keeps us going, even when things look dark. The opening notes of Over the Rainbow filled the room, but Tony's interpretation was unlike any the audience had heard. Where Garland's version soared with theatrical yearning, Tony's was intimate, conversational, finding hope in small moments rather than grand dreams. It was a masterclass in musical interpretation, showing how great songs could be endlessly rediscovered. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word, every phrase. In the dim light of the club, Tony could see faces reflecting the full range of human emotion. Some listeners moved to tears, others smiling with recognition at particularly beautiful passages. This was why he had become a singer, for moments like these when music became a bridge between souls. During the break between sets, fellow musicians approached him with something approaching reverence. Bill Evans, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table, shook his hand warmly. "That was extraordinary, Tony. You've reminded me why I fell in love with these songs in the first place." A young singer-songwriter Tony didn't recognize introduced herself as Joni Mitchell. "I write my own material," she said, "but listening to you tonight, I understand better what it means to inhabit a song completely. You don't just perform these songs, you live inside them." The second set was even more powerful than the first. Tony's confidence had grown throughout the evening, and he began taking greater interpretive risks, stretching melodies and finding new emotional depths in familiar lyrics. The audience followed him on every musical journey, trusting his artistic vision completely. As the evening wound down, Tony closed with "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," but even this signature song felt fresh and new in the intimate setting. The final notes hung in the air like a benediction, and the applause that followed was both thunderous and deeply respectful. Walking out into the cold, the autumn rain drummed against the windows of Tony Bennett's Upper East Side apartment as he sat at his easel, paintbrush poised over a half-finished canvas depicting Central Park in fall. The year was 1972, and the music industry had shifted beneath his feet like tectonic plates. The Beatles had disbanded, rock dominated the airwaves, and crooners like him were increasingly viewed as relics of a bygone era. His latest album's sales figures lay scattered across the coffee table behind him, each report more sobering than the last. Columbia Records executives had made their position clear during their last meeting: adapt or become irrelevant. The suggestion that he record contemporary hits in his style felt like asking Michelangelo to paint with crayons. "Pop, you've been staring at that same spot for 20 minutes, came a voice from the doorway. Tony Bennett, now 21 and fresh out of college, entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. His son had inherited Tony's intensity, but channeled it differently, possessing a business acumen that impressed even the seasoned professionals at Columbia. Tony accepted the coffee gratefully, setting down his brush. "Just thinking about colors, son. How to make them work together when everything around you is changing." Danny pulled up a chair beside his father, studying the painting. The park scene was rendered in Tony's characteristic style, impressionistic yet grounded, capturing not just the visual reality, but the emotional essence of the moment. "Maybe that's the answer right there." "What do you mean?" "You don't change your style to match what's trendy. You find a way to make your authenticity relevant again." Danny pointed to a section where Tony had blended autumn oranges with deep purples, creating something both familiar and surprising. "Like what you do here. Traditional techniques, but with your own vision." Tony considered this, remembering his conversation with Count Basie the previous week at the Blue Note. The legendary bandleader had faced similar challenges, watching bebop and fusion reshape jazz. Basie's advice had been characteristically direct. "Tony, you can't chase the young folks, but you can remind them why good music never goes out of style." The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Danny answered, his expression shifting as he listened. "It's Clive Davis," he whispered, covering the mouthpiece. Tony felt his stomach tighten. Davis, the president of Columbia Records, rarely called with good news these days. He took the receiver with steady hands. "Clive, Tony, we need to talk. Can you come in tomorrow morning? 10 o'clock. The line went dead before Tony could respond. He set the phone down slowly, meeting Danny's concerned gaze. What did he say? Nothing. Everything. Tony returned to his easel, but the autumn scene seemed to mock him now. How do you paint hope when winter feels inevitable? The next morning, Columbia Records offices buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major label in transition. Gold records lined the walls, but most bore the names of artists Tony barely recognized. Rock bands, folk singers, the new breed of singer-songwriters who wrote their own material and challenged every convention he held dear. Clive Davis's office occupied a corner of the 32nd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Manhattan. Davis himself was younger than Tony expected for someone wielding such power, his Harvard MBA apparent in every calculated gesture. "Tony, please sit." Davis gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "I'll get straight to the point. Your last 3 albums have underperformed significantly. The industry is changing, and our shareholders are asking hard questions about artists who aren't generating revenue." Tony had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. "Music isn't just about quarterly reports, Clive. It's about connecting with audiences," Davis interrupted. "And right now your audience is aging out, while younger listeners don't know who you are. We need to expand your appeal by having me sing rock songs, folk ballads. I tried that approach before and it nearly killed my career." Davis leaned back in his chair, studying Tony with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "What if I told you there was another way? What if instead of chasing trends, we positioned you as something timeless?" "I'm listening." "The nostalgia market is beginning to emerge. People are rediscovering classic films, vintage fashion, traditional craftsmanship. What if we marketed you not as a relic, but as a guardian of American musical heritage?" Tony felt something stir within him. Not excitement exactly, but possibility. "Go on. We'd need to be strategic. Smaller venues initially, building word of mouth. Maybe some television appearances where you could showcase your personality, not just your voice. The key is authenticity, showing people why the great American songbook matters." As Davis outlined his vision, Tony found himself thinking about his father's shoe repair shop, how Dominic Benedetto had taken pride in preserving the old techniques, even as machine-made shoes flooded the market. There had been a dignity in that preservation, a quiet rebellion against the disposable culture taking hold. "There's one more thing," Davis continued. "We'd want you to take more control over your artistic decisions, choose your own songs, work with arrangers who understand your vision. But in return, you'd need to commit fully to rebuilding your brand." Tony thought about Danny's words from the night before, about finding ways to make authenticity relevant. "What about my painting? What about it? It's part of who I am. If we're talking about authenticity, it can't just be about the music." Davis smiled for the first time during their meeting. "Actually, that could be perfect. The artist who sings, the singer who paints. It adds dimension, makes you more interesting to journalists, to audiences looking for something real in an increasingly artificial world." By the time Tony left Columbia's offices, the city seemed different somehow. The same yellow cabs filled the streets, the same hot dog vendors worked their corners, but possibility hung in the air like the first hint of spring after a long winter. He walked the 20 blocks home, needing time to process what had just occurred. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd been handed not just a lifeline, but a chance to define success on his own terms. The path wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding a career never was. But it would be authentic. That evening, he returned to his easel with renewed purpose. The autumn scene remained unfinished, but now he could see how to complete it. The key was trust. Trust in the process, in his instincts, in the possibility that quality would find its audience. Danny found him there hours later, painting by lamplight. "How did it go?" Tony didn't look up from his canvas, but his voice carried a conviction that had been absent for months. "We're going to remind people why good music matters, son. And we're going to do it our way." The brush moved across the canvas with sure strokes, adding shadows that somehow made the entire scene more luminous. Outside, New York continued its relentless rhythm. But inside this quiet apartment, something fundamental was shifting. Tony Bennett was preparing to become himself again. The maisonette room at the St. Regis Hotel had seen better decades. Its red velvet banquettes and crystal chandeliers spoke of an era when supper clubs defined New York nightlife, when Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald could pack a room just by showing up. Now, in the spring of 1975, it felt like a beautiful anachronism, much like the man preparing to take its small stage. Tony Bennett adjusted his bow tie in the cramped backstage mirror, his reflection showing the toll of recent years. At 48, he carried himself with the same dignity that had always defined him, but there were new lines around his eyes, a weight to his shoulders that spoke of battles fought and sometimes lost. "5 minutes, Mr. Bennett," the stage manager called out. The voice belonged to a young man who probably knew Tony more by reputation than experience, part of a generation that had grown up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as their musical touchstones. "Thank you." Tony's voice was steady, professional. He'd played rooms much larger than this: Madison Square Garden, Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl. But tonight felt different, more crucial somehow. This wasn't about recapturing past glory. It was about proving that what he represented still mattered. Danny Bennett appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Since graduating from college, he'd thrown himself into managing his father's career with the determination of someone who understood that they were fighting for more than just commercial success. The Times critic is here, and there's a good crowd for a Tuesday night. Not sold out, but respectable. Tony nodded, remembering when respectable would have felt like failure. Now it represented progress, each partially filled room a small victory in the campaign to rebuild his relevance. "You ready for this, Pop?" The question carried weight beyond the immediate performance. They both knew that tonight's show was being recorded for a potential live album, a risk, considering Tony's recent studio efforts had received lukewarm reception. But there was something about performing live that brought out his best, the immediate connection with an audience that no studio could replicate. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Tony replied, and meant it. The maisonette stage was intimate, close enough that Tony could see individual faces in the audience as he walked into the spotlight. The room held perhaps 200 people, a mix of longtime fans with silver hair and younger faces that suggested curiosity rather than devotion. He'd need to win them over song by song. "Good evening," he said simply, settling behind the microphone with the ease of someone for whom stages had become second homes. "It's wonderful to be here with you tonight." No elaborate introduction, no attempt to justify his presence or explain his relevance, just a man with a song to share, the way it had always been in the best rooms with the best singers. He opened with "Fly Me to the Moon," his voice cutting through the dinner conversation that always accompanied the first few numbers in supper clubs. By the second verse, forks were being set down, conversations trailing off. The room was beginning to listen. From his position at the piano, Ralph Sharon caught Tony's eye and smiled. The pianist had been with Tony for over a decade, through the commercial peaks and valleys, and he understood better than anyone how to support the singer's instincts. Tonight, those instincts were sharp. "This next song," Tony said, as the applause for "Fly Me to the Moon" died down, was written by Johnny Mandel and Johnny Mercer. It's called "The Shadow of Your Smile," and it reminds us why songwriters used to be poets. As he sang, Tony noticed a young couple at a corner table leaning forward, the woman's eyes widening as she recognized the quality of what she was hearing. This was how it worked now, not the instant mass recognition of his early fame, but the gradual realization that they were witnessing something special. The evening progressed through the great American songbook like a master class in interpretive singing. The best is yet to come. I left my heart in San Francisco because of you. Each song delivered with the accumulated wisdom of a man who had lived long enough to understand their deeper meaning. During The Way You Look Tonight, Tony caught sight of the Times critic, a stern-looking woman in her 30s scribbling notes. Her expression was unreadable, but she was paying attention, which was more than many critics had done in recent years. "You know," Tony said during a break between songs, "people sometimes ask me why I don't sing the newer songs, the rock and roll, the folk music that's so popular now. The truth is, I love all kinds of music, but these songs," he gestured to encompass the Great American Songbook, "these songs have something special. They were written by people who understood that a good song should get better with age, like wine or friendship." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the room. He was connecting not just as a performer, but as a storyteller, someone with something to say about the value of enduring artistry. The second set opened with "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing," Tony's collaboration with Ralph Sharon turning the Ellington standard into a showcase for both voice and piano. The energy in the room had shifted completely from the tentative attention of early evening to the focused appreciation of people who knew they were experiencing something rare. As the evening wound toward its close, Tony made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of ending with one of his signature songs, he chose "The Good Life," a number he'd been reluctant to perform recently because of its associations with material success during a time when his own fortunes were uncertain. But tonight, the song took on new meaning. The Good Life wasn't about chart positions or sold-out arenas. It was about this moment, this connection, this reminder that quality music performed with integrity could still move people. The applause was sustained, genuine, the kind that came from audiences who felt they'd been given something valuable. As Tony took his bows, he saw the young couple from the corner table standing, their faces bright with the discovery of something they hadn't known they needed. Backstage, Danny was already fielding calls from venue owners who'd heard about the performance through the industry grapevine. "The Carlisle wants to discuss a residency," he told his father, "and there's interest from some jazz festivals for the summer." Tony loosened his bow tie, feeling the satisfaction that came from work well done. "We're not out of the woods yet." "No," Danny agreed, "but we're on the path." As they left the St. Regis that night, Tony looked back at the maisonette's modest entrance. In a few years, rooms like this would be gone, replaced by disco clubs and rock venues. But tonight, it had been exactly what it was meant to be, a place where great songs met great singing, where the past could speak to the present with clarity and grace. The Times review would be positive, calling Tony Bennett a reminder that some traditions deserve preservation, not as museum pieces, but as living art. But Tony wouldn't read those words for hours. Right now, walking through the New York night with his son, he was already thinking about the next song, the next room, the next chance to prove that quality never goes out of style. The long road back had begun. Chapter 18. A December Decision. Snow began falling outside the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia as Tony Bennett stood in the corridor, still wearing his concert tuxedo from the previous night's performance at the Academy of Music. It was December 15th, 1977, and he should have been on his way to New York for meetings about his upcoming Carnegie Hall show. Instead, he was here, 3 floors up from the pediatric ward, trying to process what Dr. Margaret Hayes had just told him. "Mr. Bennett, I want to thank you again for agreeing to visit with the children," Dr. Hayes said, her voice carrying the careful professional tone that medical staff used when discussing difficult situations. "What you're doing today will mean more to these kids than you might realize." Tony nodded, though his mind was, the winter of 1979, settled over Manhattan like a familiar old coat, threadbare but comfortable. Tony Bennett stood at the window of his modest apartment on the Upper West Side, watching snow dust the fire escapes and transform the city's harsh edges into something softer, more forgiving. The apartment was smaller than what he'd once called home, but it felt honest in a way that the sprawling estates of his peak years never had. At 53, Tony had learned to measure success differently. The gold record still hung on his walls, but they shared space now with his paintings, watercolors of Central Park, oils of the Hudson River, sketches of street musicians he'd encountered during his long walks through the city. The apartment reflected a man who had rediscovered what mattered: art, family, and the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful in a complicated world. The phone rang, interrupting his morning contemplation. Susan's voice carried the familiar mix of affection and exasperation that characterized their relationship these days. His wife understood him better than most, having witnessed both his artistic resurrection and the personal struggles that had accompanied it. "Tony, you need to be at the studio by 11, she reminded him. "Don't tell me you forgot about the session with Bill Evans." He hadn't forgotten. Working with Evans was like discovering a new color for his palette. The pianist's delicate touch and sophisticated harmonies challenged Tony in ways that made him remember why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. But more than that, collaborating with younger artists like Evans represented something crucial: proof that authenticity could bridge any generation gap. "I'll be there," he assured her, "just watching the city wake up." "You and that window," Susan laughed. "Sometimes I think you love that view more than performing." There was truth in her teasing. The view from his window had become a meditation, a way of staying connected to the pulse of New York that had shaped him. From here, he could see people hurrying to work, children walking to school, the eternal rhythm of a city that never lost its capacity to surprise him. The recording session that afternoon proved to be one of those magical encounters that reminded Tony why he'd chosen artistic integrity over commercial compromise. Evans arrived at the studio with sheet music tucked under his arm and that quiet intensity that marked true artists. They'd planned to work on some standards, but as often happened when creative minds connected, the session evolved into something unexpected. "Let's try the touch of your lips," Evans suggested, settling behind the piano with the unconscious grace of someone born to make music, "but slower than you usually take it. Let the melody breathe." Tony nodded, understanding immediately. This was what separated real musicians from entertainers: the willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something deeper. As Evans began the introduction, his fingers finding harmonies that seemed to emerge from the silence itself, Tony felt that familiar thrill of artistic discovery. When he began to sing, his voice carried the weight of everything he'd learned in recent years: the struggles, the comebacks, the quiet moments of doubt, and the louder moments of triumph. All of it informed how he shaped each phrase. This wasn't the same voice that had conquered the charts in the 50s, but it was something more valuable. A voice seasoned by experience, tempered by humility. "That's it," Evans murmured during a break, his eyes bright with the excitement of artistic collaboration. "You're not performing the song anymore. You're living inside it." The observation struck Tony as profoundly accurate. Somewhere in the process of rebuilding his career, he'd stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. Instead, he'd learned to trust the songs themselves, to let them carry him rather than forcing them to serve his ego. After the session, Tony walked home through the early December evening, the city's Christmas decorations beginning to appear in shop windows and on street corners. The familiar sights triggered memories of other Decembers, other stages in his life, when the holiday season had meant different things. As a child in Queens, Christmas had been about family gathering in cramped apartments, his mother somehow creating magic from almost nothing. During his military service, it had been about longing for home while stationed in occupied Germany. In his early success years, Christmas performances had been elaborate affairs, all sequins and spotlight. Now, at this stage of his life, Christmas was beginning to mean something else entirely, a season of giving that went beyond the commercial expectations of show business. Over the past few years, Tony had quietly begun visiting hospitals and children's homes during the holidays, not as public relations gestures, but as personal expressions of gratitude for his own good fortune. The idea had started small. A friend had mentioned that St. Mary's Hospital for Children in Queens was looking for volunteers to spend time with young patients during the Christmas season. Tony had called anonymously, offering to visit not as a celebrity, but simply as someone willing to sing a few songs and brighten some difficult days. His first visit had been transformative. Walking through the pediatric ward, seeing children facing illnesses and uncertainties that made his own professional struggles seem insignificant, had reminded him of something essential about the purpose of music. It wasn't about chart positions or critical acclaim. It was about connection, about using whatever gifts you possessed to make someone else's burden a little lighter. That evening, as he prepared dinner in his modest kitchen, Tony found himself thinking about those hospital visits. There was something about the children's responses to music that cut through all the complexities of the entertainment industry. When he sang for them, their faces lit up, not because they recognized a famous performer, but because they recognized something true and joyful in the music itself. Susan found him at the stove, stirring a pot of soup with the same concentration he brought to his art. She'd learned to read his moods, and something in his posture suggested he was wrestling with an idea. "What's on your mind?" she asked, settling at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. "Christmas," he said simply, thinking about the hospital visits. She nodded, understanding immediately. Susan had accompanied him on several of those visits, and had witnessed firsthand how they affected him. "You're planning something special this year." It wasn't a question. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was moving toward a decision that would define not just his holiday season, but something deeper about who he was becoming as an artist and as a man. "Maybe," he admitted, "there's something about those kids. The way they listen to music, no pretense, no expectations, just pure response to whatever beauty you can offer them." That night, Tony sat at his piano, working through some of the songs he'd been considering for his holiday visits. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft notes filling the space and the distant sounds of the city beyond his windows. Each song he played carried the potential to become a gift, a moment of connection with a child facing challenges that would test anyone's faith in the goodness of the world. As he played "I'll Be Seeing You," the melody seemed to take on new meaning. The song, which he'd performed countless times for audiences around the world, transformed in the intimate setting of his living room into something more personal. A promise to remember, to carry someone in your heart even when physical presence wasn't possible. This was what his career had become, Tony realized. Not a pursuit of fame or commercial success, but a commitment to using his gifts in service of moments that mattered. The recording session with Evans that afternoon, the quiet evening at home with Susan, the anticipation of visiting children who needed whatever light he could bring to their darkened days. All of it represented a kind of success that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. The phone rang again, breaking his musical reverie. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Collins, the volunteer coordinator at St. Mary's Hospital. "Mr. Bennett, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to confirm your visit next week and tell you about one particular situation that might interest you." Tony listened as she described a young boy named Tommy Rodriguez, age 9, who had been in the hospital for several months, battling a serious illness. The child was a music lover, she explained, and had been particularly struggling with the approach of Christmas, his first away from home. "He doesn't say much," Margaret continued, "but the nurses have noticed he perks up whenever there's music playing. I thought you might want to spend some extra time with him during your visit." As Tony hung up the phone, he felt that familiar stirring of purpose that had guided him through the most important decisions of his career. This wasn't about performing for an audience or recording for posterity. This was about something more fundamental, the belief that music could serve as a bridge between one human being and another, especially when words fell short. He returned to his piano, But now the songs he played carried a different weight. Somewhere in Queens, a 9-year-old boy was facing what might be his most difficult Christmas, and Tony Bennett was preparing to bring whatever comfort his voice could offer. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of purpose he'd been searching for since he'd chosen artistic integrity over commercial success. The city beyond his windows continued its eternal rhythm, but inside the modest apartment, a different kind of music was taking shape, the quiet, determined sound of a man preparing to give the most important performance of his life, not on a stage but in a hospital room, not for thousands of fans, but for one lonely child who needed to remember that the world still contained unexpected kindness. The lobby of St. Mary's Hospital for Children carried the particular stillness that settles over places where hope and worry wage their daily battle. Tony Bennett stood near the information desk, a worn leather guitar case in one hand and a small wrapped gift in the other, observing the controlled chaos that defined such institutions. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, families clustered in waiting areas, speaking in the hushed tones that serious illness demands. And somewhere beyond the elevator doors, children faced challenges that would test the limits of their courage. Margaret Collins appeared with the kind of smile that healthcare workers perfect, genuine warmth tempered by the practical realities of their environment. She was a woman in her 50s, grey-haired and sturdy, with the bearing of someone who had learned to carry other people's burdens without losing her own capacity for joy. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming. The children have been looking forward to this all week." As they walked toward the elevator, Margaret filled him in on the layout of the pediatric ward. The children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, each facing different medical challenges, but all sharing the common experience of spending the holiday season away from the familiar comforts of home. "We've set up in the recreation room for your main performance," she explained, "but I wanted to talk to you again about Tommy Rodriguez. He's been here since September, and Christmas has been particularly difficult for him." The elevator rose silently, and Tony found himself thinking about the nature of the gift he was preparing to offer. In his decades of performing, he'd learned that the most powerful music emerged from the intersection of technical skill and emotional truth. But here, in this hospital, surrounded by children facing circumstances that demanded extraordinary bravery, the stakes felt different. This wasn't about entertainment, it was about connection, about using whatever gifts he possessed to remind these young patients that they weren't forgotten. The pediatric ward bustled with the kind of organized activity that characterized good hospitals. Decorated for Christmas with paper snowflakes and construction paper trees, the hallways maintained a determined cheerfulness that couldn't quite mask the underlying seriousness of the place. Children in wheelchairs moved past with their families, some wearing the distinctive baseball caps that covered the evidence of medical treatments. Others connected to machines that monitored their vital signs with electronic vigilance. In the recreation room, about 20 children had gathered, ranging from preschoolers to early teenagers. Some sat in regular chairs, others in wheelchairs, a few accompanied by IV poles that served as mechanical companions. Their faces carried the particular brightness that comes from having genuine surprise added to a routine that rarely included such additions. Tony set up his guitar and looked out at his audience, feeling the familiar stirring of purpose that preceded his most meaningful performances. These children didn't know about his chart successes or his Grammy Awards. They simply knew that a man with a guitar had come to sing for them on a December afternoon when they couldn't be home with their families. He began with White Christmas, his voice finding that particular warmth that had made him a master of intimate performance. But as he sang, watching the faces before him, the song transformed from a nostalgic standard into something more immediate, a recognition of longing, an acknowledgement that sometimes Christmas happened in unexpected places. A little girl in the front row, perhaps 6 years old, began humming along, Her head was covered with a colorful scarf, and her eyes held the kind of wisdom that comes from facing adult challenges while still maintaining a child's capacity for wonder. When Tony noticed her participation, he adjusted his performance to include her, making their shared musical moment into a conversation between two people who understood that music could provide comfort when everything else felt uncertain. After performing several songs for the group, Tony spent time moving among the children individually, signing autographs and chatting about their favorite music. But throughout the visit, his thoughts kept returning to Margaret's description of Tommy Rodriguez, the 9-year-old who was struggling particularly with his first Christmas away from home. When the group performance concluded, Margaret led Tony down a quieter hallway toward the long-term care section of the ward. The atmosphere here felt different, less bustling, more contemplative. These were the rooms where children faced extended stays, where families maintained vigils that stretched across weeks and months. "Tommy's room is just ahead," Margaret said softly. "He knows you're coming, but he's been pretty withdrawn lately. Don't take it personally if he doesn't respond much at first." Room 312 was decorated with get-well cards and drawings from classmates, but the decorations couldn't hide the clinical reality of the space. Medical equipment lined one wall, and the bed was positioned to allow easy access for the nurses and doctors who monitored Tommy's condition around the clock. The boy himself sat propped up against several pillows, a comic book open on his lap, but his eyes fixed on the window that looked out over the hospital parking lot. He was small for 9 years old, with dark hair that showed the effects of medical treatment and large brown eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any child should carry. "Tommy," Margaret said gently, "this is Mr. Bennett. He's the singer I told you about." The boy turned toward them with the careful politeness that children learn when they've spent too much time around adults who speak in serious tones. He offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi," Tommy said quietly. Tony approached the bed with the easy manner that had served him well in countless situations where genuine connection mattered more than star power. He set his guitar case down and pulled up the room's single visitor chair. "Hi, Tommy. Margaret tells me you like music." The boy nodded, his attention moving to the guitar case with the first sign of real interest Tony had seen from him. "Are you going to play something?" "If you'd like me to." "What kind of songs do you like?" For the first time, Tommy's expression brightened slightly. "My dad used to play guitar. He taught me some songs before." He paused, the sentence trailing off into the complicated territory of families dealing with serious illness. Tony understood immediately. In households facing medical crises, normal activities like music lessons often became casualties of the overwhelming demands of treatment schedules, insurance battles, and the simple exhaustion that accompanies long. The December wind whipped through the canyon of Manhattan streets as Tony Bennett pulled his overcoat tighter and quickened his pace toward Mount Sinai Hospital. The year was 1985. And at 59, he had learned to recognize the moments that mattered most, those that had nothing to do with applause or album sales, but everything to do with the quiet spaces where humanity revealed itself. His manager, Tony Bennett, had initially resisted the idea of these hospital visits. "Pop, you've got 3 interviews tomorrow and rehearsals for the New Year's Eve show. Can't the charity appearance wait?" But Tony had been firm. Since his career resurgence in the late 70s, he'd made it a personal mission to spend time with children in hospitals during the holiday season. No press, no photographers, just him, his voice, and whatever comfort he could offer. The hospital lobby smelled of antiseptic and pine from the modest Christmas tree near the reception desk. Tony approached the volunteer coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Henderson, whose tired eyes brightened when she recognized him. "Mr. Bennett, thank you so much for coming. The children's ward is on the 7th floor. Dr. Martinez is waiting to brief you on the patients you'll be visiting today." In the elevator, Tony studied his reflection in the polished steel doors. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, etched by both triumph and struggle. His hair, now completely silver, caught the fluorescent light. He thought about his own childhood, those lean years after his father's death, when Christmas had been more about making do than celebrating. Those memories had never left him. They'd shaped his understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures could illuminate the darkest moments. Dr. Martinez, a compact man with gentle hands and kind eyes, met him at the nurse's station. "Mr. Bennett, most of our young patients today are dealing with various stages of treatment. Some are here for surgery, others for ongoing care. I should mention that we have one particular case, a boy named Michael. He's 8 years old, who's been with us for several weeks now. Leukemia. His family." Dr. Martinez paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're struggling in every way you can imagine." Tony nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. "What can you tell me about him?" "Michael loves music. His mother mentioned he knows all the words to I Left My Heart in San Francisco, but he's been withdrawn lately. The treatment is hard, and being away from home during Christmas." Dr. Martinez's voice trailed off. They walked down the hallway, past rooms decorated with paper snowflakes and handmade ornaments. Tony could hear the mixture of sounds that defined pediatric wards. Quiet conversations, the beep of monitors, occasional laughter that seemed to shine brighter for its rarity. Through open doors, he glimpsed families gathered around small beds, parents reading stories or holding tiny hands. The first few visits went well. Tony sang softly to a 5-year-old girl recovering from appendix surgery, her parents tearfully grateful. He shared stories with twin boys who peppered him with questions about famous singers he'd met. Each interaction reminded him why these visits mattered. In a place where childhood was interrupted by medical realities, bringing a piece of the outside world, a touch of magic and normalcy, felt essential. Michael's room was at the end of the hall. Through the partially open door, Tony could see a small figure huddled under blankets, facing away from the entrance. A woman sat in a chair beside the bed, her head in her hands. The silence in the room felt heavier than in the others. Dr. Martinez knocked gently. "Mrs. Patterson, I have someone here who'd like to meet Michael." The woman looked up, and Tony was struck by how young she appeared, despite the exhaustion written across her features. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her clothes, jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, spoke of someone who'd been living in waiting rooms and hospital chairs. "Michael," she said softly, touching her son's shoulder, "there's someone special here to see you." The boy turned slowly, and Tony felt his heart contract. Michael's face was pale and thin, his dark eyes large in his small face. A knit cap covered his head, but wisps of hair peeked out at the edges. Despite his condition, there was something alert and intelligent in his gaze as he focused on Tony. "Are you really Tony Bennett?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. Tony approached the bed slowly, as if Michael were a bird that might startle. "I am. And you must be Michael. I heard you're a music lover." For the first time, a small smile crossed the boy's face. "Mom plays your records at home?" "Well, she used to, before." He glanced toward his mother, who was fighting back tears. Tony pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, bringing himself to Michael's eye level. "What's your favorite song?" "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," Michael replied without hesitation. "Mom says you made it famous, but it makes her sad now because we might have to sell our house." The simple honesty of the statement hit Tony harder than he'd expected. Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes, clearly embarrassed that her 8-year-old had revealed their financial struggles to a stranger, even a famous one. "Michael," Tony said gently, "would you like me to sing it for you? Just for you?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Tony began, his voice soft and intimate, transforming the clinical room into something warmer. As he sang, he watched Michael's face light up, the pain and fear momentarily forgotten. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes, but she was smiling too. When the song ended, Michael clapped. Weak applause, but genuine. That was beautiful. Will you sing another one? For the next hour, Tony sang song after song, telling stories between numbers about the famous venues where he'd performed, the other musicians he'd met, the cities he'd visited. Michael asked questions with the curiosity of any 8-year-old, temporarily freed from the weight of his illness. Mrs. Patterson relaxed for the first time in what looked like weeks, occasionally laughing at Tony's stories or adding details when Michael asked about places they'd never been. As Tony prepared to leave, Michael reached out and touched his hand. "Mr. Bennett, will you come back? I mean, if I'm still here?" The question, asked with heartbreaking matter-of-factness, settled into Tony's chest like a stone. "I'll come back, Michael. I promise." Walking back down the hallway, Tony felt the familiar mixture of inspiration and heartbreak that these visits always brought. In the elevator, Dr. Martinez thanked him quietly. "You don't know what that meant to them. Michael hasn't shown that much interest in anything for days." Back on the street, the December evening had settled over Manhattan with its particular urban magic. Lights reflecting off wet pavement, the bustle of holiday shoppers, the sound of car horns mixing with distant music from store windows. But Tony's mind remained in rooms 7 and 18, with a boy who faced Christmas in a hospital bed and a mother trying to hold her world together. He thought about his own success, the comfortable life he'd built through decades of work and struggle. Then he thought about Michael's simple request that he return, and the weight of promises made to children who might not have time for those promises to be kept. As he walked home through the busy streets, Tony Bennett made a decision that would prove to define not just Michael's Christmas, but his own understanding of what it truly meant to give. 3 days passed before Tony could return to Mount Sinai, and those 3 days weighed on him more heavily than he'd expected. Between rehearsals for upcoming television appearances and meetings with his record label about a new album, he found his thoughts drifting constantly to room 718. During a recording session for a holiday special, he stumbled over lyrics he'd sung thousands of times, his mind elsewhere. "Pop, you okay?" Danny asked during a break. "You seemed distracted." Tony looked at his son, now his manager and the architect of his career resurrection. Danny had inherited Tony's business acumen, but also his father's sensitivity, though he tried to hide the latter behind professional efficiency. "There's a boy at the hospital," Tony said simply. "I promised I'd come back." Danny nodded, understanding without need for explanation. He'd grown up watching his father navigate the balance between career demands and personal commitments, learning early that some promises transcended contracts and schedules. When Tony returned to the hospital, he found Michael's room transformed. Christmas cards covered every available surface, cards from classmates, neighbors, and family members. A small artificial tree sat on the windowsill, decorated with paper angels that looked handmade. But despite the festive decorations, Michael appeared frailer than before, his skin almost translucent under the harsh hospital lighting. "Mrs. Patterson, please call me Karen," she'd said, looked exhausted but managed a genuine smile when she saw Tony. "He's been asking about you every day. The nurses probably think we're making it up, that Tony Bennett actually visited." Michael's eyes lit up when he saw Tony, though the effort of sitting up in bed clearly took energy he didn't have to spare. "You came back. I thought maybe I dreamed it. I keep my promises, especially to friends," Tony said, pulling the familiar chair close to the bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," Michael admitted, "but better now. Will you sing again?" Tony sang, but quietly, sensing that Michael's energy was more fragile than before. Between songs they talked about Michael's school, his friends, his love of baseball, despite never having been to a game. Karen filled in details, painting a picture of a bright, curious boy whose world had suddenly contracted to hospital rooms and treatment schedules. "He wants to be a teacher when he grows up," Karen said, smoothing Michael's blanket. "He says he wants to help kids learn about music and art." "That's a wonderful dream," Tony said. "Teachers are some of the most important people in the world. My art teacher, Mrs. Moller, changed my life. She saw something in me that I didn't even know was there." Michael's eyes drooped as Tony spoke, but he fought to stay awake. "Tell me about her. Tell me about school when you were little." So Tony found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone, about growing up poor in Queens, about finding refuge in art and music when the world felt too big and scary, about the teachers who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Karen listened as intently as Michael, and Tony realized these stories weren't just for the boy, they were for the mother too, offering hope that difficult circumstances didn't have to define a person's future. When Michael finally fell asleep, Karen walked Tony to the hallway. Under the fluorescent lights, she looked even younger and more vulnerable. "Mr. Bennett," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with her words. "Tony, please." "Tony, I need to tell you something. The doctors, they're not sure how much time we have. Michael's case is complicated, and the treatments aren't responding the way they hoped." Her voice stayed steady, but tears gathered in her eyes. "He talks about you constantly, about the promises you made to come back, about the songs you'll teach him. I don't want to ask too much, but what is it, Karen? Christmas is in 2 weeks. If something happens before then, if this is his last Christmas." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Tony understood. "I'll be here," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, I'll be here." Over the following days, Tony restructured his schedule around Michael's room. He cancelled a lucrative private performance in the Hamptons and rescheduled recording sessions, much to his business manager's dismay. But Danny supported the decision, recognizing something in his father's voice that brooked no argument. Tony began bringing things from his own life to share with Michael. Photographs from his travels, sketches from his art collection, even his own worn copy of sheet music from "I Left My Heart in San Francisco." Michael treasured each item, studying Tony's sketches with the intensity of an art critic and asking detailed questions about the places in the photographs. "This is Paris?" Michael asked, holding a black and white photograph of Tony performing at the Olympia Music Hall. "That's Paris. The most beautiful city in the world, some people say. The lights at night look like jewels scattered across black velvet. Have you painted it?" "Many times. Maybe someday we'll go there together, and you can see it for yourself." Karen shot Tony a warning look over Michael's head, but the boy was already lost in the image, imagining himself in that distant, glittering city. Dr. Martinez pulled Tony aside after one visit, his expression grave. "I need to be honest with you about Michael's condition. The latest tests show that the leukemia isn't responding to treatment as we'd hoped. His family, they're facing some very difficult decisions." "What kind of decisions?" "Whether to continue aggressive treatment that might give him a few more months or to focus on making him comfortable. The aggressive treatment would mean spending Christmas here, possibly his last Christmas, fighting side effects that would make him very sick. The comfort care would mean he could go home, but Tony understood the implications. Home might mean weeks instead of months, but those weeks would be with his family, in familiar surroundings, with whatever peace they could find. What does Michael want? He wants to go home for Christmas. He talks about it constantly, showing you his room, his books, his mother's piano. But Karen is afraid to give up on the treatments, afraid that taking him home means giving up on him entirely. That evening, Tony sat in his apartment overlooking Central Park, staring out at the twinkling lights of the city. The luxury surrounding him, the artwork on his walls, the grand piano, the view that had inspired countless songs, suddenly felt overwhelming. He thought about Michael's simple wish to go home for Christmas and about Karen's impossible choice between hope and acceptance. He picked up his phone and dialed Danny's number. "I need you to arrange something," Tony said when his son answered. "Something important." "What is it, Pop?" "I want to give a concert, a private concert, in Michael's living room." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure? The logistics alone?" "I'm sure. If Michael can't have a normal Christmas, then we'll bring Christmas to him. The best Christmas we can possibly give." "Dad, you do realize that if the press gets wind of this—" "No press," Tony said firmly. "This isn't about publicity or good deeds or anything else. This is about a promise to a friend. Can you make it happen? Danny's voice softened. Yeah, Pop, I can make it happen. As Tony hung up the phone, he looked out again at the city lights, but now they seemed to shine with different purpose. He was about to embark on the most important performance of his career, one that no audience would ever hear about, one that would never be recorded or remembered by history, but one that would mean everything to an 8-year-old boy who just wanted to go.